Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes. Today we're going deep.
Deep.
Yeah, into Mahatma Gandhi's autobiography, The Story of My Experiments with Truth.
Oh, yeah.
It's a big one. So
It's a hefty read.
it is a hefty read, so we're going to break it down for you.
Yeah.
Um,
It's interesting how he frames his life story. It's not, just a straight chronological telling of all the things that happen. It's really his personal and philosophical evolution. And it's all kind of framed around this idea of experimenting with truth.
yeah, and that pursuit takes him on quite a journey. He's constantly kind of pushing himself
Oh, absolutely.
and questioning things.
Constantly questioning his assumptions. And one of the things that makes this book so compelling is his honesty. He's very open about his flaws and his struggles, which makes him surprisingly relatable, even as he achieves these incredible things.
So before we jump into the details, I think it'd be good to give our listener a bit of an overview. What are the main themes that run through the book? What are the big ideas that he's grappling with throughout his life?
Sure. So one of the big ones is satyagraha. And this is his philosophy of nonviolent resistance. But it's not just about passive protest. It's a much deeper concept that's really rooted in truth and love, and this willingness to suffer for a just cause.
And you see this philosophy kind of evolving as he faces all these different challenges in his life, from discrimination in South Africa to the fight for India's independence.
Absolutely. And another big theme is this idea of self-restraint,
Hmm.
which he refers to as brahmacharya. And he practices this throughout his life. He really believes that it's essential for spiritual growth and self-mastery.
And he takes this to some pretty extreme length
He does.
with fasting and dietary restrictions and celibacy. It's
Yes.
not for the faint of heart.
Not for everyone. But that's what's so interesting. He doesn't shy away from the difficulties and complexities of these experiments. He's constantly questioning himself, adapting his approach, sharing his failures as well as his successes.
Yeah, so let's rewind all the way back to the beginning. Gandhi starts his story in Porbandar, India, and he's born into a family with really strong religious and cultural influences.
Right. His family's Vaishnava background, which is a branch of Hinduism emphasizing devotion and nonviolence, that really shaped his early understanding of morality and spirituality.
Yeah, and even as a child, you see glimpses of this really strong moral compass. He shares this anecdote about refusing to cheat on a spelling test, even when his teacher kind of prompts him to. He just couldn't bring himself to betray his own sense of right and wrong.
Yeah, it's a small moment, but it really reveals this deep commitment to truthfulness, something that becomes a cornerstone of his entire philosophy.
He also talks about his arranged marriage, which happened when he was very young, which was a common practice at the time. And this relationship becomes a really significant part of his journey, both personally and philosophically.
Absolutely. And he grapples with the challenges and the complexities of marriage, and he eventually comes to see it as this path to self-control and mutual growth.
And it seems like this early experience kind of ties into his later exploration of brahmacharya, which, like we said, he understands is this much broader concept than just celibacy.
Exactly. For Gandhi, brahmacharya encompasses control over all senses and desires, this way to channel his energy towards higher pursuits and ultimately connect with the divine.
Now, in his late teens, Gandhi makes this huge decision to travel to England to study law. And this is a major culture shock for him. It throws him into a world that's completely different from his upbringing.
Right. He really struggles to adapt at first. He faces loneliness and prejudice and all these temptations that challenge his deeply held beliefs.
And one of these challenges is his vegetarianism. He talks about feeling pressured to eat meat by his friends, who believed it was essential for strength and success in English society.
Right. And he even experiments with meat eating for a while. But it creates this huge internal conflict for him. He feels like he's betraying his values and harming his health.
And then he comes across this book that changes everything, A Plea for Vegetarianism by Henry Salt.
Yeah, and this book really solidifies his commitment to vegetarianism, not just as a personal choice, but as a moral imperative based on compassion and nonviolence towards all living beings.
It's amazing how a single book can have such a profound impact on someone's life.
It is, and this becomes a recurring theme throughout his autobiography. He was a voracious reader. He constantly sought knowledge from all these different sources, and it refined his own understanding and inspired his actions.
So after finishing his law studies, Gandhi heads to South Africa to practice law. And, he expects a more welcoming environment, given his British ties. But he's quickly disillusioned.
Yeah, he faces even more blatant racism and discrimination in South Africa, and it kind of culminates in this horrifying incident where he's thrown off a train just because of his race.
This is a pivotal moment for him. It really ignites his activism. and sets him on this path to fighting for justice and equality.
It also becomes the crucible for his philosophy of satyagraha. He realizes that fighting violence with violence just perpetuates the cycle of suffering. He needs a different approach, one that appeals to the conscience and seeks to convert opponents rather than defeat them.
And that's where his commitment to truth and self-restraint becomes so crucial. He believes that only through personal transformation can he effectively challenge these larger systems of injustice.
Right, and he sees satyagraha as a way of life, a constant practice of seeking truth, remaining firm in your convictions, and being willing to suffer for what you believe in.
It's a pretty radical idea,
Yeah.
especially in the context of colonialism and racial oppression.
Yeah.
But he's determined to put it to the test.
And this determination leads him to establish Tolstoy Farm, which is this communal living experiment inspired by the writings of Leo Tolstoy. It's a fascinating chapter in his story, where he's putting his ideals into practice on this smaller scale.
So what was the purpose of Tolstoy Farm? Like, what was he hoping to achieve there?
He envisioned it as a training ground for satyagraha, a place where people could learn to live simply and practice self-sufficiency, and develop the discipline and the resilience needed for nonviolent resistance.
There's also a way for him to explore his ideas about community and education and self-governance.
Yeah, he believed that true social change starts with individual transformation, and that by creating this model community based on his principles, he could inspire others and demonstrate the practicality of his vision.
So it became like a microcosm of his larger ambitions for India.
Exactly, a space where he could experiment with his ideas, refine his methods, and prepare himself and his followers for the challenges ahead.
And these early experiments, although often difficult, they become crucial stepping stones on his path to becoming the leader that we know him as today.
They lay the foundation for his later campaigns in India and really solidified his belief in the power of nonviolent resistance to challenge even the most deeply entrenched systems of injustice.
All right, so we've laid the groundwork here. We've kind of set the stage for Gandhi's journey. But there's so much more to explore. So join us next time as we dive deeper into his experiences in South Africa and the development of his philosophy of satyagraha. We'll see how he puts his ideas into action and the challenges and the triumphs that he faces along the way. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you in the next episode.
See you then. You know, it's really striking how his time in South Africa shapes his understanding of satyagraha. This is where he really puts it into practice, refines it through all these different campaigns and confrontations with this really unjust system.
Yeah, I mean, it's one thing to have a philosophy. It's another to, actually live it out, especially in such a, high-stakes environment. So, what were some of these early campaigns that really kind of stand out?
Well, there are many, but one that I think is often overlooked is the campaign against the Asiatic Registration Act in 1906. This law was called the Black Act by Indians, and it required all Indians to register with the government and carry a passbook at all times. It was incredibly discriminatory and humiliating.
Yeah, it sounds a bit like a precursor to apartheid.
Yes, very much so. And Gandhi saw this as a direct attack on the dignity and rights of Indians. He organized this huge resistance movement, urging Indians to defy the law and face imprisonment, rather than submit to this injustice.
And this is where his concept of satyagraha really comes into play, right? He's not just saying, go break the law. It's a very specific kind of resistance.
Exactly. He emphasizes nonviolent self-discipline, a willingness to suffer for the cause. He believes that by remaining steadfast in their principles, even when they're facing punishment, satyagrahis can expose the immorality of these laws and awaken the conscience of their oppressors.
And it's interesting how this campaign, even though it was ultimately unsuccessful in repealing the law, it's a turning point for Gandhi.
Absolutely. He learned so much about the power of mass mobilization, the importance of organization, and the need to constantly adapt his strategies, based on what's happening. These are all lessons that he carries with him back to India.
So after more than 20 years in South Africa, Gandhi returns to India in 1915. And, he's a much more seasoned leader at this point. And he jumps right into the fight for India's independence.
Right, but his approach is different from many other nationalist leaders at the time. He's not interested in violent revolution or political maneuvering. He really believes that true freedom has to be won through this kind of moral and spiritual transformation, both at the individual and societal level.
And this is where his ideas about Swadeshi come in, right? This idea of self-reliance.
Yeah.
He believes that India needs to free itself from this dependence on Britain, both economically and culturally. And this starts with individuals embracing a simple life, supporting local industries, and rediscovering their own cultural heritage.
And this leads him to champion the use of khadi, which is hand-spun cloth, as a symbol of Swadeshi and a way to empower those rural communities. He even learns to spin yarn himself and makes it this daily practice and encourages others to do the same.
It's amazing how he connects his personal practices with his political vision. It's not just about wearing different clothes. It's about this fundamental shift in mindset
Absolutely.
and rejecting the systems of colonialism.
It's about reclaiming Indian identity.
So let's talk about some of the key campaigns that he leads in India. We touched on Champaran and Kedah a little bit, but I think it's worth diving a bit deeper.
Sure, Champaran in 1917, this was his first major campaign in India. He goes there to help indigo farmers, who are being forced to cultivate indigo on their land for British planters under this really oppressive system called Tinkathia.
And this system basically trapped farmers in this cycle of debt and poverty by forcing them to sell their indigo crops
Yeah.
at really low prices that were set by the planters.
Right, it was a deeply exploitative system.
Yeah.
And Gandhi uses his satyagraha methods. He mobilizes the farmers, gathers evidence of this exploitation, and puts pressure on the authorities to address these grievances. He even faces arrest. But his imprisonment actually amplifies the movement and forces the government to concede to some of the farmers' demands.
It's a fascinating example of how he uses nonviolent resistance, not to defeat an opponent, but to really expose the injustice
Right.
and appeal to their sense of fairness,
Exactly.
almost forcing them to confront the immorality of what they're doing.
And it's a strategy that proves surprisingly effective, even against this powerful colonial regime.
So then a year later, he takes on the Kedah Satyagraha, which is a response to this severe famine in the region. Farmers are facing crop failure. They can't pay their taxes. But the British government refuses to grant them any relief.
And Gandhi steps in again, organizes the farmers to refuse payment of taxes until the government agrees to suspend collection for the year. He argues that it's morally wrong for the government to extract these taxes from people who are literally struggling to survive.
This is a really powerful example of Swaraj right, self-rule. He's basically saying that the people have the right to govern themselves and that they should resist unjust laws
Exactly.
that don't serve their interests.
And while this campaign doesn't lead to complete victory, it does force the government to make some concessions.
Right.
And acknowledge the plight of the farmer.
I mean, these early campaigns are so fascinating
Mm-hmm.
because they're like these building blocks
Mm-hmm.
leading up to this much larger movement for independence. He's refining his methods. He's building a following. He's demonstrating that nonviolent resistance can actually work to challenge British rule.
And he's laying the groundwork for these iconic movements that will come later, like the non-cooperation movement and the Salt Satyagraha.
Yeah, let's talk about those. The non-cooperation movement launched in 1920. This is a really audacious move. He's calling for a complete boycott of British institutions like courts, schools, legislative councils, government jobs. It's basically like rejecting the entire system.
And it resonates with millions of Indians who join the movement, renouncing their titles, boycotting British goods, participating in these mass protests and demonstrations.
It's huge.
It was this incredible display of unity and a direct challenge to British authority.
But it's not without its challenges, right?
Of course not.
Like there are internal disagreements, and even some violence breaks out, which forces Gandhi to call off the movement.
And this is a moment of real soul-searching for Gandhi. He questions his methods, his leadership. He even considers withdrawing from public life. But
Right.
ultimately, he realizes that nonviolence is the only path, even when it's hard, even when there are setbacks.
Yeah, it's a real testament to his commitment to these principles and his willingness to constantly reassess and adapt his approach based on what's happening.
Right, and this leads him to the Salt Satyagraha in 1930, which is perhaps his most iconic campaign, and the one that really captures the world's attention.
Yeah, the image of Gandhi leading these thousands of followers on this march to the sea to make salt in defiance of British law. It's just incredibly powerful. It's such a simple act, but it carries so much weight.
Salt is a symbol of life and purity in many cultures. And by choosing salt, Gandhi is challenging this British monopoly and asserting the right of Indians to self-determination.
And it's such a smart way to connect with everyday Indians. Salt was something everyone needed, and this tax on it was deeply unjust.
Right, the Salt Satyagraha triggers this wave of civil disobedience across India. People are making salt everywhere, refusing to pay the tax, facing imprisonment with incredible courage.
And Gandhi's arrest during this campaign just fuels it even further. And the British government is forced to respond with brutality.
The world is watching, and the images of these peaceful protesters being beaten and arrested are creating this huge PR nightmare for the British.
This campaign, more than any other,
Yeah.
exposes the moral bankruptcy of British rule.
And it really galvanizes global support for Indian independence.
It's a turning point.
It really is a testament to the power of nonviolent resistance.
I mean, it's incredible to think about the impact of the Salt Satyagraha. It really captured the world's attention, put so much pressure on the British government.
Yeah, and what's so fascinating is how Gandhi consistently used these symbolic acts to challenge the foundations of British rule. Salt was just one example. He also targeted the textile industry, encouraged Indians to boycott British cloth and spin their own khadi.
Yeah, we talked about that earlier, but it's worth emphasizing how central that idea of Swadeshi was. Self-reliance, to his whole vision for India. It wasn't just about political independence, it was about economic and cultural liberation as well.
He wanted Indians to rediscover their own heritage, their skills, their capacity for self-governance, and khadi was a powerful symbol of that, this rejection of British dominance, reclaiming their identity.
And it wasn't just symbolic, it had real economic implications too.
Oh, absolutely.
Empowering communities,
Yeah.
creating a sense of self-sufficiency.
It's a great example of how he linked his personal practices to his larger political vision. He saw the interconnectedness of everything, recognized that individual choices could have this ripple effect on society.
Now, as we get closer to India's independence in 1947, we see Gandhi grappling with these really complex challenges. The country's on the verge of partition, and there's all this communal violence erupting between Hindus and Muslims.
And this was a really painful period for Gandhi. He always advocated for Hindu-Muslim unity. He saw it as essential for the future of India. And the partition and the violence, it really shattered his hopes for this unified, peaceful nation.
And he tirelessly travels across the country, trying to stop the violence, console the victims, just appealing for peace and reconciliation.
But things were spiraling out of control, and he felt this deep sense of failure.
He even undertakes these fasts unto death, to try and stop the bloodshed.
Putting his own life on the line.
It's just such a testament to his commitment to nonviolence and his compassion for humanity.
But tragically, his efforts weren't enough to prevent the partition and all the suffering that came with it.
And then in a really cruel twist of fate, Gandhi is assassinated by a Hindu nationalist in 1948, just months after India achieves independence.
It's a devastating loss for India and for the world. But even in his final days, he remained this beacon of hope, urging his followers to continue the struggle for peace and justice through nonviolent means.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into his autobiography, I'm curious, what do you see as his most enduring legacy?
For me, it's the power of his example. He lived his principles, even when it was incredibly difficult and dangerous. He showed the world that nonviolent resistance could be this force, more powerful than armies and empires.
Yeah, and he also demonstrated the importance of personal transformation.
Right.
As a catalyst for social change.
Right.
That real freedom starts within.
Yeah.
And by cultivating these qualities, self-restraint, compassion, commitment to truth, we can create a more just and peaceful world.
His life and his writing, they remind us that we all have the power to make a difference, no matter how small our actions may seem.
That's a powerful message.
It is.
Even all these years later, the story of my experiments with truth. It's not just a historical document. It's like a guidebook for anyone who's seeking to live a more meaningful life.
It challenges us to question, to confront injustice, to strive for a better world.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Gandhi's incredible life and legacy. We hope you'll pick up a copy of his book and embark on your own journey of exploration and self-discovery.
Yeah, it's a journey worth taking.